Hi everyone, my name's Mike and welcome to the latest video. Today we're going to be looking at a bike that you don't see an awful lot of on UK roads, and that is a Moto Morini 500. So this bike's one of Richard's. He's the guy who had the V7 Moto Guzzi and the Triumph TR6C, and he bought this bike a couple of weeks ago. Both Richard and I have both owned Moto Morinis back in the late 70s, early 80s, and it's a bike that we really love, and it's a real kind of exotic bike. As I said, you don't see a lot of them around. So he's very kindly going to let me have a go on it, so we're going to have a look at it, but we're also going to do a little bit of a history on Moto Morini. And also we have a new member of the team, a guy called Steve, who's joined us today, and he turned up on a modern day Moto Morini, a Moto Morini Gran Passo. So we'll talk a little bit about the modern range, and we'll talk obviously about the history of it, and we'll get to ride this beautiful bike of Richard's. So as always, thank you very much for the support. We really appreciate all your comments and your likes and subscribes, and we're on a roll at the moment. We've got a load of bikes lined up and we're keen to keep going, so if you'd like to keep watching and keep on top of everything, please like and subscribe and hit the notification bell, and we'll keep doing the best we can to keep bringing you new bikes. So thank you very much again, and on with the show. Okay, so this is Richard, and this is his new Moto Morini 500 that you got, what, a couple of weeks ago?
It is, Mike, yes, probably 2 or 3 weeks ago, and in fact today is the longest trip I've done on it. So I was expecting a few teething problems. It was about 25-30 miles here this morning. I'd done a bit of fettling to it yesterday, getting it ready, and actually it's running really well, which is good because it's hardly been used for the last 10 years.
Excellent.
Anyway, so why did I buy it? Well, I'd always fancied a Morini 500, a bit of a bucket list bike, and I thought this one came up from a member of the Morini Riders Club, the Owners Club, and it was a right bike, very original, as you can see. It's a 1981, a very early 6-speed one, which was the spec that I wanted. I think Moto Morini, like Ducati, like Moto Guzzi, some of the Italian manufacturers, they sort of lost the plot a bit with the styling, the aesthetics in the early 80s. And this one is, as I said, first of the 6-speed, so technically what I wanted, and cosmetically what I wanted
it's
as well.
Last of the pretty ones, isn't it?
Last of the pretty ones, yeah. I mean, actually, this one, when I had it, had the original optional extra fairing, and Mike and Dave were both saying, oh, it's a bit GPO Bantamish. It's like slightly square, and the lines didn't quite suit it. I tried to love it because it was very original, it had that period charm, but in the end, rightly or wrongly, I decided to take it off.
And you can put it back on if you want to go touring
put it back on.
It.
Anyway, so we'll start with a little bit of a potted history of Morini, because a lot of people don't really know much about them. They sort of overshadowed a bit by Moto Guzzi and especially Ducati, you know, and Ducati came from, still in Bologna actually. Moto Morini were in Bologna as well. They were set up in 1937 by Alfonso Morini, so just pre-Second World War. He originally started by making small three-wheel trucks, but then obviously Second World War came shortly after that, after the Second World War, they mainly made small two-strokes, and then after that it developed and they sort of made small four-stroke singles. But always overshadowed by Ducati, as I said, and Moto Guzzi. So they've always been a small manufacturer. They were into racing. They thought that was a good way of selling bikes, and they were into their racing. And in the early 60s, they developed a 250 single-cylinder race bike, which in 1963, ridden by Tarquino Provini, nearly beat the mighty Honda 250 four-cylinder Grand Prix bike. So giving away loads of horsepower,
Yep.
but what it lost in horsepower, it made up for being light, nimble, very narrow, and obviously had a fantastic rider as well.
Did you know that Agostini started his career on a Morini?
Yeah, Agostino started his career on Morini before going over to MV Agusta. So, yeah, and that took them to the late 60s, and then Alfonso Morini died in 1969, and the reins were handed over to his daughter Gabriella. Now, she was quite foresighted and could see the way the market was changing, and especially with the Japanese manufacturers coming on the scene, which were sort of undercutting them on price and with very sophisticated, reliable machines. So Gabriella Morini headhunted this young engineer from Ferrari called, I'm trying to remember what he was called, Franco Lambertini.
Yep.
That's it. Well done, Mike. Now, he used some of the lessons that he had learned from Ferrari, and he introduced a range of bikes, started designing them in sort of 1969, and over the few years he came up with the concept of a modular V-twin engine using Heron cylinder heads and overhead valves, so push rods, but driven by a belt to the camshaft, and then short stubby little push rods to an overhead valve. Now the Heron heads, for those of you who don't know, rather than using a conventional hemispherical cylinder head design, the cylinder head is built into the top of the piston. Pros and cons, but the reason they did it, it was cheaper manufacturing, and it also made for a very torquey, fuel efficient engine because it helped the flows of the spark across the parallel valves. So a lot to be said for it, and they went very well. Now, due to the modular construction, he could then share components with other engines. So he came up with initially a 350 V-twin, because that was attractive to the Italian market, because it dodged their over 350 tax rules. That meant anything over 350 that was very expensive to own due to the tax. So initially it was a 350, and then that was in about 1974 he introduced those. And very widely acclaimed, but only ever a niche bike.
Both you and I own 350s.
But you and I, Mike, of course,
yeah.
We both had them back in the day in the sort of early 80s. I mean, they were very highly regarded. They were considered very exotic because they were only made in small quantities. And the drawback was they were very, very expensive. I think a 350 Morini back in the day was actually more expensive than a Bonneville or a Norton Commander or a Honda CB750.
I seem to remember when I bought mine, which was a second-hand one, brand new, they were about £1,400,
yeah.
Which was,
huge
a lot of money
for a little 350. But they had a cult following, and then over the years he developed a 125 single cylinder, which was basically half the 250 V-twin, and he developed a 250 single cylinder. He used the front cylinder, so it was like a sloper single. So a 125 single, a 250 single, and then in the late 70s, 78 I think it was, he introduced the 500, because I think the European market then, that they worked under the premise bigger is better, and as much as people loved the 350 or the 3.5 as they were called, they wanted something a bit bigger, a bit torquier, something that you didn't have to work quite as hard, and something which was better for longer distances. And that's what attracted me to this. As much as I loved my 3.5 Sport back in the day, I always hankered after something with all those virtues, but a bit torquier, a bit longer legged, and better for longer distances. The other change compared to 3.5 is I had a longer swing arm, longer wheelbase, so lost a little bit in agility, but just better for longer distances and more stable. So this, as I said, is an 81. It's a Sport. This would have had clip-ons back in the day, but like a lot of blokes my age, I struggle with the clip-ons, and this has got some period swan necks fitted, so you've got the best of both worlds really. The other difference with the 500 over the 3.5, they introduced an electric start on it, and I think it's fair to say the early 500s, they had a few teething problems. They weren't developed as well as they should have been when they were first released. The electric starts didn't work very well. They had awful carburation problems. They didn't really go as well as they should have. And funnily enough though, the guy I bought this off, he's now about 70, Pete. He had a brand new 500, an early one from 78, and he rode all over Europe on it. He did about 30,000 miles in about 3 or 4 years, literally every country in Europe. And once he got over the initial niggles, he said it was the best bike he ever had, and he's had loads and loads of bikes. He's even got a Brus Superior now, which he's had for years, inherited from his dad, but he still says that original Morini 500 was the best bike he ever owned. So there you go. As I said, I've only done a few trips on it, only had it a few weeks, but so far so good. This is a really well sorted one. Said 81, they've got over the initial teething problems. They introduced a 6-speed box, which actually makes it a lot better. It's like the 5-speed gear ratios, but it's got a lower first gear, and it really helps it get off the market. It's a lot quicker accelerating. I think the period road tests showed this took about a second off the standing quarter mile, so it actually goes surprisingly well.
Excellent. Okay, all right, well thank you very much for that, Rich. We'll take a few riding shots of it now, eh?
Okay, good.
Lovely, thanks a lot.
No problem.
Okay, so now it's my turn on the bike, Mike. As I said before, I am a Morini owner from many years ago, so back in late 70s, early 80s. In fact, it was the last road bike I had before I bought my RD350LC that I went production racing with. Completely different bike, but I absolutely loved the Morini. It was stylish, it was fantastic handling, like incredible handling, and enough power, but it was, you know, compared to an RD350LC, it wouldn't pull a Boy Scout off a grandmother, but it was still a nice road bike. And the thing I noticed getting on Rich's, and even though it's a lot of years apart, I can really feel that there's a difference in torque. This has got a lot more torque, and it makes a much nicer road bike because it has got that little bit extra power. But in terms of similarities with the 3.5, the handling, it's just sublime. The handling on this bike is just wonderful. it's like a 250 Grand Prix bike. It's light, it's light, it's got really good suspension. Even though this is set up for Rich, it's still really all it needs was a couple of notches on the preload on the Marzocchis, and it would have been perfect for me. But you know, it's great. You can hear me kind of chasing the revs. That speedo's in kilometres an hour. If you think I'm doing 130 mile an hour, I'm actually not. I'm doing about 60. But it's wonderful. It's great. You know, for a classic bike, superb brakes, superb handling. It's just as I remember my 350. And in fact, you know, it's a bit nicer. And one thing that did strike me, it's a right-hand gear change, and something that I'd forgotten about, not thought about for 40 years or whatever, is if you kind of rest your foot with your toe near the gear change, you get a really high-pitched vibration coming up through the gear change. And I'd completely forgotten all about that. And Richards does exactly the same thing. So it's it's a wonderful trip down memory lane for me. And it's just a sweet bike. It's sweet looking. You know, you can see from the pictures that bright red paintwork, the bright red frame. You know, the proportions on it are perfect. I do like the look of the 350. The 3.5 Sport, I think, has got to be one of the most beautiful bikes ever built. And this comes close. When Rich turned up, we filmed this at in the grounds of the pub at Herbistock near Wrexham, and when Rich turned up, I was just blown away by how pretty the bike looked. You know, in the bright red, and the sun was glinting off it. But yeah, it's a jolly bike, and it suits him down to the ground. You know, Rich has left his fast riding days behind him. He's a great rider, very good rider, but he's less keen on thrashing down country lanes, and this is just perfect. You know, it's lightweight, and it is very similar to the V7 Guzzi. Makes power differently. Hard to describe it really. They're both V twins, but this kind of lopes along this. It's almost like, in terms of the engine, it almost rides like a Triumph Twin. It sounds a bit strange, and Dave might correct me on this, but that's how it feels to me. It feels like a nicely sorted British Twin. It hasn't got the low down grunt of a 650. So I don't know about. I haven't ridden a 500, but maybe a 500 Daytona, you know, nicely sorted. Actually, Richard's 650 is TR6C. That's what it feels like. It's a similar sort of performance. Obviously, this revs harder, but yeah, it's got that same, you know, lovely loping. You know, it's a really nice place to be on a Sunday afternoon. You know, it's great in traffic, and here I am now. I'm back at the lake where we started off. There's that beast of a Gran Passo. So thanks a lot, Rich. Thank you so much. So I just want to go through where Morini are these days, and where they've been since the 2000s. So Maurizio, who's Franco's son, relaunched the company in 2003, and he employed Lambertini as the head of technology, and Lambertini developed the V-twin engine, the water-cooled 1200cc Bielbero Corto Corsa engine. So it's an 87 degree V-twin, so it's got good natural primary balance, water cooled, fuel injected, and 140 horsepower. I'm not quite sure of the torque, but it's significant. These bikes are known for the storming engine they've got in them. So they put that engine into a trellis frame, which was made by Velici, who I believe also made or make the frames for Ducati. And they brought out two models. So they brought out the Corsaro, the 1200cc Corsaro, which had 140 horsepower, and that was what we would now know as a super naked. And they brought out the 9.5, which had a 950cc version of the engine, and that was more of a standard bike. So they sold okay, fairly small numbers. 2007 they brought out new versions of the Corsaro. They made improvements to it, a better chassis and suspension, and then they brought out the Scramblers 1200, and they also brought out the Gran Passo, which is the bike that Steve turned up on today. Again, only selling, you know, a trickle of sales really. So the company went into voluntary liquidation in 2010 and filed for bankruptcy, but the liquidator restarted production because they found that they had parts left over from the Gran Passo and the Scramblers. So it struggled on for a while, and then it was acquired by two Italian entrepreneurs, and in 2013 they brought out a new range of bikes which were Euro 4 compliant. So they brought out the Corsaro ZZ and the ZT, which used a 1200 engine, and they brought out the Milano, which I think is my favourite of the Morinis. It harks back to the 3.5 and uses that, you know, lovely paint job on it. They also brought out a Rebello, which is a 1200cc bike, which was unique in that it had an electrically controlled seat hump. So you pressed a button on the dash and you could convert the bike from single seat to dual seat, which was a little bit strange, but there you go. Okay, so yeah, it struggled on till 2018, and it was bought out by the Chinese Zhongsheng Group, and they've used the existing 650 engine that they have in production, which is actually the bike in the CF Moto 650, which is based on the Kawasaki ER6 engine, which is a very successful engine, and in CF Moto form they've had quite a bit of racing success in Super Twins, and they've even raced them at the Isle of Man. So it's a good well proven engine. So they brought out an adventure bike called the Escape, or X-Cape, and they also are going to be bringing out the Simezzo, which is a road-going version of the using that 6.5 engine, and they're also keeping production going of the Corsaros and the Milano. So I think the future's looking quite bright for them. So, you know, I'm a great lover of Morini, and I've got a lot of affection for the brand. So I wish them every success, and hope they go from strength to strength.